From shoveling salt mounds under the Mexican sun, to scraping every last hair off a goatskin, we got an inside look at the people keeping age-old traditions and businesses alive around the globe. Whether they are protecting traditional methods threatened by modernization, or running centuries-old family businesses that have adapted to a changing world, we set out to find out how and why they are still standing. Making phyllo by hand can take up to 4 hours. The super thin, layered dough is used in many dishes in Greek cuisine, like the famous baklava. And at 86 years old, Yorios Hatziparaskos is one of the few bakers in Greece that still makes it manually. He started baking as a teenager and was able to buy his own workshop in the 1960s. At one point, bakeries like his were all over Greece. But the rise of cheap and efficient industrial baking meant that many mom-and-pop shops just couldn't stay afloat. Yorios found a way to stay in business by focusing on the tourist trade and employing only his wife Katerina and his son Paraskevas. We visited their half-century-old bakery to see how it is still standing. Every day around 8 a.m., Yorios opens the doors to their workshop, and Katerina hangs signs to draw people in. The 17th century Venetian-style house stands in the heart of the old town in Rethymno on the Greek island of Crete. To start the phyllo dough, Yorios puts just 3 ingredients into a large mixer: flour, water, and salt. Half an hour later, he transfers the mixture to this roller machine to be flattened and stretched. Paraskevas portions out smaller pieces that need to be exactly
1 kilo, 300. Αυτό έχει να κάνει με τις διαστάσεις του τραπεζιού στο οποίο θα το ανοίξουμε. Αν το τραπέζι ήταν μεγαλύτερο, θα ήθελε περισσότερη ζύμη, οπότε θα βάζαμε παραπάνω ζυμάρι.
While father and son knead the dough balls, mother cooks lunch. Yorios rolls each piece by hand, shaping them into discs. Then, it's time for the toss. There is a reason behind this eye-catching technique.
Το βοηθάει να γίνει λίγο πιο λεπτό στη μέση, επειδή το χοντρό κομμάτι μένει στην άκρη που το τραβάς. Να μην μείνει πολύ χοντρό στη μέση.
The dough is stretched over and over again until the whole table is covered. It becomes so thin, you can read through it. Katerina covers each dough layer with linen to absorb moisture slowly without losing elasticity. Then, the family repeats the process layer by layer until there's several tissue-thin sheets stacked on each table. Going round and round the table is so physically demanding that Yorios has to rest in between turns.
Είναι πολύ σκληρή δουλειά και το φύλλο.
Once the dough is slightly dry, it's ready to be folded. For the Hatziparaskoses, it's almost like a dance, with precisely coordinated movements, including a dusting of flour to prevent the sheets from sticking together. The phyllo leaves are then cut to size to be stored in the fridge until they're sold. But all this work doesn't guarantee big sales.
Εκείνο το φύλλο που μαζέψαν ή και ρωτούσαν και λέει 320 φύλλα, του είπα ζήτημα να είναι 12 κιλά. Αν τα δώσεις ζαχαροπλαστείο είναι 60 ευρώ.
So the family's profits rely mostly on the sweets sold to tourists that come in curious to see how phyllo is handmade.
Πριν 10 χρόνια ή πιο παλιά είχαμε πάνω από 100 ξενοδοχεία πελάτες. Αλλά η εκβιομηχάνηση σιγά σιγά τους έκανε να αγοράζουν τα έτοιμα προϊόντα.
Machine-made phyllo is cheaper and faster. Efficient industrial production lines can churn out 100 to 300 kilograms of dough an hour. The stiff competition doesn't deter Yorios. He also makes kataifi, a shredded pastry that is even more taxing for the 86-year-old. It takes him 3 hours, and it sells for even less than the traditional sheets of phyllo.
Βγάζουμε λίγο γιατί οι τουρίστες που έρχονται να το δουν, να βγάλουν μια φωτογραφία και πουλάμε γλυκά. Δύσκολο, μπορεί να μην το πετύχει, να το πετάξει όλο. Όλο έτσι. Βράδυ που πονάμε.
Και κάποιες φορές αν νιώθεις κουρασμένος, βλέποντάς το να συνεχίζει σε αυτήν την ηλικία να δουλεύει, ξεχνάς την κούραση και συνεχίζεις κι εσύ.
Paraskevas is actually an engineer, but he found himself without a job after the 2010 economic crisis in Greece. So he decided to help his parents with the family business.
Ούτε εγώ δεν περίμενα που θα φτάξω. Έλεγα άμα πάω στα 60 χρόνια, 65, θα βάλω και το στρατό να πάρω τη σύνταξη να κάτσω. Μετά λέω άντε ακόμα άλλα 5 χρόνια, άντε άλλα 5 χρόνια.
Just as Yorgos's business depends on tourism, he too loves to travel when he can.
Αγγλία, Αούστρια, Βιέννα, Γαλλία, Ουγγάρια, Βουδαπέστη, Ισπάνια, Μαρόκο. Εδώ πέρα δουλεύω και δεν μένει χρόνος να βγω καθόλου. Μία εβδομάδα φεύγω και πάω έξω και έτσι λέω στον τουρίστα, τουρίστα εσύ, τουρίστα και εμείς.
If it weren't for the COVID-19 pandemic, he would have visited the Netherlands to see friends he made when they visited his shop year after year. Greece was quick to control the spread of the virus from the spring through the summer, but cases have spiked in the fall and brought the country to a nationwide second lockdown in November. Tourist traffic to the Hatsoparaskas' workshop has dropped significantly in 2020. Lines to get in weren't uncommon in better years.
Εσύ ξέρεις από κρου που ήταν. Όταν έφτανε σε ένα κρου που ήταν 20 άτομα, ήταν πιο ελεύθερα.
But it still remains an important landmark for the community, and locals will say it's the town's main attraction.
Το 2007, τέτοιο καιρό, τη γιορτή τουρισμού, στις 27 Σεπτεμβρίου, μας βράδυσε στον κήπο ο Δήμος Ρεθύμνης για την προσφορά μας στον τουρισμό. Το βραβείο του καλού επαγγελματία. Ο Δήμαρχος εδάκρυσε, διότι είπα ευχαριστώ του Δήμου και αυτό ήρθα από τόσα χρόνια που αυτό, τα τουριστικά γραφεία, τους ξεναγούς, τα μέσα αυτά που με κάνουν διάσημα και τελευταίως τη σύζυγό μου.
Πιστεύω αυτό ικανοποιεί και τους γονείς και ειδικά τον πατέρα μου που χαίρεται που κάποιος θα το συνεχίσει. Ελπίζω και κάποιο από τα παιδιά μου να έρθουν έτσι τα πράγματα ώστε να ασχοληθεί επαγγελματικά.
A 17th century inscription above the door has been there since long before the family moved in, and it serves as a reminder of the importance of their work. In virtue, a house shines.
The palm of the hand is the essential tool for getting this painting technique just right. Rogan Art is a centuries-old craft, and it's been in Abdul Ghaffur Khatri's family for 8 generations. These designs were once popular throughout India, but the rise of industrial textiles forced many artisans to leave the craft for more lucrative work. Today, the Khatri family members say they're the only Rogan artists left in the world.
परंपरा है हमारी, दादाजी, पिताजी और चाचा जी वगैरह, तो हमारी पीढ़ी दर पीढ़ी ये कला चली आ रही है.
But the COVID-19 pandemic is now threatening their business. We take a look at how one family has left this tradition still standing. It all starts with castor oil. It's the base of the paint, and it's what gives the art its name. Rogan means oil in Farsi. Ghaffur's cousin, Mohammed, heats the oil for 2 days until it becomes a honey-like texture. It's a dangerous process only a few can handle.
4-5 kg जो ऑयल होता है उसमें कभी भी फायर हो सकता है, तो ये बहुत डेंजर भी है और इस प्रोसेस के लिए हमारे सभी परिवार के लोग मास्टर नहीं है.
Once it's cooled, Ghaffur's nephew Jabbar combines it with pigment to create the paint.
उसको पत्थर के ऊपर रगड़ के पानी से थोड़ा भिगो के ग्राइंड करके रोगन उसमें वो भी अंदाजे से मिलाया जाता है. ऐसा नहीं कि 100 ग्राम रोगन है 50 ग्राम, वो ऐसा नहीं, अंदाजे से वो कूटते हैं दूसरे पत्थर से, वो रंग और रोगन एक हो गया.
Then it's time to paint. Gafoor says it's the use of the hand that gives Rogan Art its unique quality.
अगर कटोरी से डायरेक्ट उस कलम को कलर से उठाया तो डायरेक्ट आप उसका तार नहीं बना सकते क्योंकि बहुत थिक रहता है। अभी उसको हाथ पे रख के इस कोने पे रख के हमको रगड़ना है।
Swirling the paint into his palm creates heat to thin it out. Then, Gafoor floats the thread of paint over the fabric using a metal rod. He runs his other hand underneath the cloth to guide the paint. He has an idea of the final design in his mind, but the painting process is completely freehand.
जो पूरा तार इसका परफेक्ट जो चल सकेगा, कितना खींचेगा, वो सब आर्टिस्ट के दिमाग में रहता है। ये सब गॉड गिफ्ट है, कुल मिला के गॉड गिफ्ट है। ये हर किसी की बस की बात नहीं है, न किसी मशीन का काम है इस चीज़ के लिए।
Before it dries, Gafoor folds the cloth to print the design's mirror image. He can finish some pieces in 5 days, while more complex designs can take him up to 2 years.
इसमें जो बारीकी है, ये येलो कलर की, वो एक एक बिंदी से कलम की पॉइंट से रखी गई है, जिसके लिए बहुत समय जाता है और ये खास अपने आप में खास इसलिए माना जाता है।
Wall art pieces like this one can cost over $1,000. Gafoor and his family normally sell their pieces to tourists, but the pandemic put a strain on their peak season.
और अभी तक तो ये बता सकते हैं कि पूरा लॉस में ही है क्योंकि टूरिस्ट नहीं आए, तो ये बिजनेस टूरिस्ट के ऊपर जो डिपेंड है और तो कोई सोर्स है नहीं, तो क्या करना। अभी हम बैठे हैं, राह देखते हैं क्या होने वाला है, क्या होगा, क्या करना है।
The struggle feels familiar. The art is said to have come to India from Persia 400 years ago, and it was once popular on bedding and ceremonial clothing here in India. But with the rise of mass-produced textiles in the 80s, locals lost interest in these more expensive, handmade pieces. Many artisans couldn't compete with mass manufacturers and dropped their crafts to find other work. Gafoor, too, made the hard decision to leave the family business and look for work in Mumbai.
पहले बताया कि 1980 के आसपास मैंने तय कर लिया था कि मैं इस कला में अपना जीवन बर्बाद नहीं करूँगा, और हमारा थोड़ा बहुत इस बात से थोड़ा ये भी हुआ परिवार के सामने, क्योंकि उस समय गांव का कोई लड़के को वहाँ तक मुंबई तक भेजना वगैरह तो वो बहुत बड़ी चीज़ लगती थी, मैं समझता हूँ।
But a sense of responsibility and a plea from his family brought him back.
और तू नहीं आया तो ये पीढ़ी बंद होगी, आगे नहीं चलेगी। और मुझे याद है उस समय मैंने उनसे ये वादा भी किया था कि अभी मैं पूरी लाइफ इसी कला के पीछे लगा दूंगा और दुनिया भर में कोशिश करूंगा कि दुनिया भर में इस कला का नाम हो। मैं ये भी बता सकता हूँ कि वो वादा अभी पूरा हो गया।
Since then, Gafoor has brought Rogan Art to the international level. He's earned over 10 awards for his work, and India's Prime Minister gifted one of his pieces to President Barack Obama in 2014. And just as Gafoor learned from his elders, now his nephew is determined to carry on the legacy.
हाँ, मतलब जैसे मैंने पहली बार ट्राई किया तो थोड़ा डिफ़िकल्ट लगा, फिर जब धीरे धीरे स्टेप बाय स्टेप हमको सीखने को मिला तो तभी जाके मतलब नहीं, ये एक बहुत बड़ी विरासत है हमारी फैमिली को और इसको हमें बचा के रखनी चाहिए।
He's committed to preserving Rogan art through education and social media.
वो ज़रूरी है और इसलिए कि क्योंकि हमारे जैसे फैमिली मेम्बर लिमिटेड है 10 लोग, तो हम अभी ट्रेनिंग भी दे रहे हैं कि लोगों को थोड़ा नॉलेज मिले कि यार इतना रेयर है।
Before the pandemic, the Khatri family ran workshops. Since 2010, they've trained around 300 women, and 20 of them went on to work for the family. But when COVID-19 started to spread in March, business slowed and Gafoor couldn't afford to keep them employed. Still, the family stays relevant with new products like face masks, and they have big plans to expand the business.
तो हम ये भी चाहते हैं कि कोई 2-3 डिज़ाइनर हो ऐसे इंडिया से या बाहर से कहीं पे भी जो हमारी हेल्प करे डिज़ाइनिंग में, ताकि हम उसको और ज़्यादा एक्सप्लोर कर सकते हैं आउट ऑफ इंडिया।
Though sales might be slow until tourists can start visiting again, Gafoor believes he knows what it takes to be successful.
इस कला के लिए तो पेशेंस ही पेशेंस चाहिए, लेकिन इस कला को सेल के लिए भी पेशेंस रखना पड़ता है।
Bidri art is a form of metalworking from India that hasn't changed in 600 years. The 8-step process involves molten metals, hours of chiseling, and an eye for detail. The secret ingredient? A special soil that can only be found inside a fort in the city of Bidri. But in an industry with already tight profit margins and expensive raw materials, the art form may not be around for much longer.
काम बंद होने का खतरा होता है, काम चलते आ रहा, आज हमारे हाथ में.
We visited some of the last artisans who still know the craft to see how it's still standing. Bidri art begins with metal casting. An artisan uses a finished piece to make the mold. He piles sand on top and packs it as tightly as possible with the help of his body weight. Now, the mold is ready to cast a new piece. The worker melts pieces of zinc and copper over a small fire. Then he pours the molten metal into the mold. It takes about 5 minutes for the metal to cool and solidify. Then it's time to reveal the final shape.
जैसे माँ पेट में बच्चा है तो पैदा होने के बाद ही मालूम होता है वो लड़की है या लड़का है. तो जब हम मटेरियल जब पेटी के अंदर डालते हैं वो फेल हुआ या पास हुआ वो खोलने के बाद ही मालूम होता है.
Mohammed Ibrahim takes on buffing and polishing, using one of the only pieces of modern equipment in the workshop. Then he covers the piece with a copper sulfate solution. This creates a chalkboard-like surface for the artisans to sketch out a design. They begin to chisel away at the metal, following the sketch. It's the most time-consuming part of the process. Sometimes they spend an entire day chiseling. Next, the artisan hammers a silver or gold wire into the engraving. It's detailed work that takes patience and good eyesight. That's why this glasses salesman comes by the workshop every month.
नहीं लगाया तो आँख में मोतिया पर्दा व्हील बिजली काम के लिए होना जरूरी है साहब क्योंकि वो बारीक काम है.
Meanwhile, another worker welds the pieces together to form a vase. Then it goes through a few rounds of buffing, filing, and cleaning. Finally, workers boil together water, soil, and aluminum chloride. They soak the piece in the hot mud to give it the signature black color. The wire resists the coloration, so the design stands out against the dark background. The soil used in this process is what makes Bidri art unique.
ये बहुत बड़ी बात है दुनिया में ये किसी भी मिट्टी से ये कलर काला ना होता सिवाय बिदर के खिले की मिट्टी से काला होता.
It comes from a 600-year-old fort, which is just about 3 miles away from Mohammed Salimuddin's workshop. He says a chemical used in the fort's construction gives the soil a special quality.
वो प्रोसेस के चुनने से ही जो ज़मीन पे अफेक्ट होता है मैग्नेटिक अफेक्ट हो जाता है उसके अंदर की मिट्टी से ही ये कलर ब्लैक होता है. तो चोरी छुपी से हमारे कोई एक आधा बंदा जाके तो वो एक बार थैला ला लिए तो 8-10 साल इजीली चलता है.
Mohammed says Bidri artisans have never been stopped by security. But before taking the soil, he checks the quality.
इसलिए टेस्ट करते हैं कि थोड़ी सी खारापना होता है सर. Perfect.
The fort was built by the Bahmani dynasty. They're credited with bringing metalworkers from Iran and popularizing Bidriware between the 14th and 15th centuries. The art flourished through the 1800s, when it was showcased at exhibitions in Europe. But a fall in demand towards the end of the 20th century and the rising cost of silver in the 2000s put a strain on artists' livelihoods.
पहले 400 रुपये को 10 ग्राम सिल्वर मिलता था, अब 750-800 रुपये को 10 ग्राम हो गया.
The pandemic has also raised export costs and kept tourists from visiting Bidr, slashing Mohammed's sales.
2019 में जो सेल हुई थी, उसकी 10% भी इस साल सेल नहीं हुई सर. 10% भी नहीं हुई सेल. अब पता नहीं कितने साल लगेंगे हालात सुधरने के लिए इंडस्ट्री के.
Today, Mohammed says there are around 10 workshops in Bidri, but he worries they won't be around for much longer.
अब धीरे धीरे ये क्राफ्ट भी घट रही है, न्यू जनरेशन उससे जुड़ रहा नहीं, तो ये आर्टिजनों की तादाद दिन ब दिन गिरते जा रही है.
Mohammed has managed to stay in business by expanding his market with online sales. He sells pieces at his brick-and-mortar shop too, just a short walk from the artisans' workshops. A vase that takes up to 3 days to make goes for 3,000 rupees, or $41. Mohammed says he purposefully prices his goods to just about break even, to keep turnover high.
ज़्यादा अगर रेट रखे तो बिकने में देरी करता है आइटम, काम चलने से मतलब, बस उतनी मार्जिन रखता है सर.
The pieces that require more time and resources cost more, like this bust. It took 20 days to make, and it's selling for 60,000 rupees, or just over $800. And this plate that took nearly 2 months to make cost 200,000 rupees, or about $3,000. Hardships aside, Mohammed is happy, so long as the whole industry works together.
मैं अपने बिजनेस से सेटिस्फाई हूँ सर, लेकिन मैं चाहता हूँ कि मैं सेटिस्फाई, मैं एक रहने से काम नहीं चलता, पूरी इंडस्ट्री को बिजनेस मिले. नहीं, बिद्री क्राफ्ट में तो कोई कंपटीशन नहीं है सर हमारा, क्योंकि हम जो काम करते हैं पूरे इंडस्ट्री के लोग एक मिलजुल के काम आना चाहते हैं.
Potters in India are turning away from the craft to survive. They churn out thousands of these lamps called diye in the months leading up to the Hindu festival of Diwali. But it's a hard life with small profits, and the once vibrant communities of artisans have been drying up.
और काम आता नहीं हमें, पापा मम्मी ने और काम सिखाया नहीं, यही काम हमारा खानदानी काम है.
We went to Delhi to see how the traditional diya makers are still standing. Ashok Kumar uses a mixture of 2 different types of clay and cow dung as the base for making diye. He prepares it in bulk months in advance and keeps a large pile under a tarp in the corner of his home.
तब ये मेरे साथ लगे रहते, इस काम में मेहनत है. अब तो ये मशीन ले ली थी हमने, मशीन की वजह से थोड़ा सा ना खाने का टाइम है, ना नहाने का, ना सोने का.
Sitting on the floor, Ashok and his nephew work together on a potter's wheel to quickly turn a large chunk of wet clay into hundreds of small lamps.
दीवे एक आदमी से नहीं बनेंगे, एक बनाएगा तो एक काट के रखेगा.
Each one is quickly shaped upward by hand, pinched in to create the bowl, and then cut off at the base with wire. It's a rhythm they sustain until there's just enough clay left to shape one more. Piece by piece, they lay the lamps out to air dry. Once they're completely dry, Ashok fires the diye in large wood-burning kilns.
अब 3 भट्टी बनाई हैं, 20,000 एक 15,000 आते हैं एक भट्टी में. भट्टी में सही निकल गया तो हमारा है, नहीं तो बेकार है.
Despite the kiln's large capacity, many lamps get broken or discolored. So after a week of the entire process, Ashok only ends up with about 10,000. His daughters and mother also help out by counting and sorting the fired lamps to get them ready to sell in bulk. 1,000 of them sell for 300 rupees. That's only about $4 and is not enough to sustain his family.
अब इसका हमारी मेहनत को लगाए तो कम से कम 600-700 रुपए 1000 तो होना चाहिए, जब जाकर कुछ बनेगा.
These low prices are a reflection of the disposable nature of clay diye. Small ones this size burn for about an hour if they aren't refilled, and most just get thrown away after one use. So some consumers have switched over to reusable electric lights for their celebrations. LEDs and battery-powered lights have become more popular as they're easier and cleaner to use. On top of that, the COVID-19 pandemic closed some local markets in 2020 and kept many vendors from selling on the street.
पिछले साल तो दीवा हमारा रुका ही नहीं था, माल जो भी बनाया था सब चला जा रहा था, अब कहीं गया ही नहीं है. आप देखो तो हमारे 2 कमरे भरे हुए हैं माल से, डिमांड ही नहीं है.
Another problem for potters like Ashok? Air pollution. For the past few years, the local government in Delhi ordered wood-burning kilns to be shut down for air quality.
भट्टी में पानी डाल देते हैं, अभी 3-4 रोज हुए हैं, भट्टी में पानी डाल दिया हमारी में, माल खराब हो गया सारा पूरी भट्टी का।
To try to avoid this, he usually fires up his kiln overnight.
धुआं है, भाई हम कहाँ जाएंगे, हमारा भी तो पेट है, हम भी कहाँ से खाएंगे, काम हमारा खानदानी यही काम है।
And even with these risks, other potters in the same area have boosted their businesses by making different products that aren't just DA, like flower pots.
हर रोज एक आइटम बदल करके बनता है। मार्केट में कोई कमी नहीं है। मार्केट ये है कि लोग देखिए इस कॉलोनी में बहुत जगह से माल आता है, यहाँ से विदेश भी जाता है।
Despite the hard work, Vinod Prasad takes pride in his family's history.
इनाम के लेकर के जाता तो मैं कामयाब नहीं हो पाता, तो इसलिए मैंने बहुत परिश्रम किया।
As for Ashok and his own legacy, he actually hopes for a brighter future for younger generations.
भाई हमारे बच्चे मट्टी से निकल जाएं, कहीं पढ़ लिख जाएं, कहीं लग जाएं।
This is one of the last places in the world that makes papyrus paper. People in this small Egyptian village reinvented the ancient process in the 1970s. And the industry thrived, selling papyrus art to tourists. But today, there's little demand for the paper, and the plant is nearly extinct in Egypt. Those that remain are determined to carry on this piece of Egypt's history. We visited El Karamus to see how the ancient craft is still standing. Ataf Mohammed Shahaita spends about 2 hours harvesting papyrus by hand from the single acre he owns. It takes a year for a papyrus seedling to grow to this size. After it's cut down, it grows back in 1 or 2 months. At one point, the village's land was filled with the plant. But today, there are only 10 acres left. Ataf carries the plant about a mile to his workshop, where he employs 7 people. They chop the stalks based on the size they want the paper. Then, workers spend the entire day cutting the papyrus into thin strips, using a fishing line. This method is more efficient than the ancient process.
كان عشان يشرخوا بيشرخوا بالسكينة، احنا عندنا فتلة خيط بلاستيك.
But it's still exhausting.
مسكة الخيط كده ومسكة العود يعني مش سهلة، مش أي حد يعرف يعملها.
The strips soak in hot water mixed with potassium hydrate for a couple days. The chemicals speed up the fermentation process.
بنشرخ بيها. عندنا التخمير كان زمان هم بخمروا بيبطي أسبوع و2، احنا بنقعد بنخمر يوم و2.
Then they rinse the strips with water and chlorine to lighten the color.
اللون الورقة كانت غامقة عندهم، احنا عندنا صنعنا اللون بالكرول. عاد عندنا كرول بيدينا اللون الفاتح والغامق، بنتحكم فيه يعني.
Workers lay out the wet papyrus strip by strip. Each sheet of paper has 2 layers, one vertical and one horizontal, to strengthen it. Then, the stack goes into the compressor to dry.
كان زمان ايام الفراعنه كان لما بيجوا يكبسوا الورق بقى يجيبوا حجاره ويكبسوها، احنا عندنا مكابس.
After that, the sheets are sandwiched between pieces of cardboard to soak up any leftover moisture.
100% كده الورقه نشفت اهي. كده خلصت على الغيار، كده تمام. نحطه في كيس ونعد الورق لايه، مثلا واحد عايز مثلا 500,000 ورقه بنديها له.
Ataf sells the paper to artists across the village, including Saeed Tarahan. He started out farming the plant, and today he works as an artist.
فتعالى واخد بالك شوف شتله واخد بالك صغيره واخد بالك مزروعه شفتها واخد بالك بدات تكبر والموضوع بدا يعني ايه نكبر معاه. اكبر فتره من عمري وانا بمارسها بقت جزء مني.
But since the COVID-19 pandemic put a halt on tourism, he struggled to find a market. He had to close down his shop and lay off his workers just a couple weeks ago. Now he works out of his home.
مفروض واخد بالك ده شكل أنوبس موجود على خزنة توت عنخ آمون، ادي اسمه موجود وانوبس واخد بالك على خزن، ده مقطع منه يعني. المفروض ان صندوق المجوهرات بتاعه وده واخد بالك. هنبدا واخد بالك نملى المساحات ونعمل شكله اللي موجود في الاصل يعني.
All of Said's paintings include ancient Egyptian motifs to pay homage to Papyrus's origin.
كان ليها عند الفراعنه واخد بالك تاريخ وليها قيمه احنا حاسين بيه، وعشان كده واخد بالك يعني لان دي قصه وتاريخ، فاحنا محتفظين واخد بالك بالكلام ده وعارفين قيمته.
Egyptians invented papyrus paper at least 5,000 years ago, replacing clay tablets and revolutionizing the written word. They used it for things like marriage contracts and shopping lists. They also turned the plant into a weaving material for sandals and baskets. Cheaper paper made from wood pulp or plant fibers eventually replaced papyrus paper, and the plant became nearly extinct in Egypt by the early 1800s, until an art professor and an engineer brought back seeds from other African countries in the 1970s. They set up plantations and workshops in El Karamus. And papyrus became the center of the local economy.
الورق البردي لما نزل قراموس احنا اشتغلناه فيه، كان احنا بنزرع اراضينا قمح، الجنيه هو افضل من زرع القمح يعني بيكسب.
Almost everyone in the village was involved with processing raw materials or making artwork to sell to tourists. Said got into papyrus because his cousin was the art professor who helped revive it. He remembers it as a turning point for the village.
فدي واخد بالك اهي زراعه جديده لكن اثرت فينا واخد بالك يعني اقتصاديا المردود والعائد الاقتصادي واخد بالك والثقافي والاجتماعي لا غيرتنا واخد بالك بالطبع. كان تغيير واخد بالك للاحسن.
But after the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011, tourism in Egypt crashed. The country saw a 63% drop in visitors over the following years through 2016. And the market for papyrus paper nearly vanished. A decade later, the industry had just started to recover when the pandemic hit. Said has gotten just one order in the past week. A painting like this normally sells to tourist shops for 50 Egyptian pounds, or $3. Bigger and more detailed pieces go for up to 500 Egyptian pounds, or $32. But with sales down, Said has had to work another job to keep his business afloat. And he says he'll do everything he can to save the art.
الناس أصبحت واخد بالك النهارده بقت حاجة أساسية جدا في حياتنا. لا ما ينفعش، ما ينفعش. شعوري أنا الشخصي واخد بالك في حالة إن أنا يعني هحس واخد بالك إن أنا افتقدت حاجة مهمة جدا جدا في حياتي.
Atef is also determined to keep Egypt's history alive.
فدي مش حكايه فلوس، ان هي ايام جدي وابويا ان هي موجودين واحنا تربينا عليها يعني. ازعل جامد ان انقرضت الورق البردي يعني.
And with Egypt's tourism industry expected to recover this year, Said is holding out hope for papyrus.
أنا توقعي واخد بالك إنه لهذه الحرفة الازدهار إن شاء الله، بدليل حجم المتاحف اللي بتنشأ واخد بالك في مصر، وهي عموما السياحة في مصر تمرض ولا تموت.
Soaking yarn by hand is the ancient method this dye house has been using for over a century. It's one of the last in Egypt, a country long known for its textile industry.
أنا بشتغل شغلتي دلوقتي أيام الفراعنة.
Salama Selem has been the one keeping the vats full and the fires burning since 1975, even as industrial competition and the global pandemic have threatened his livelihood. We first visited the workshop in 2019 and came back to see how it's weathering the pandemic. Through it all, one man's love for the craft has kept this tradition still standing. Salama begins a batch by prepping the yarn. He separates the white threads into sections.
أنا دي شغلتي، فبنقض له التخين لوحده وبنقض له الرفيع لوحده، لما يروح يشتغل يعرف إن ده لوحده وده لوحده.
Then his sons mix dye with water that's just the right temperature. The hotter the water, the brighter the color. It takes 2 people to dunk the yarn into the 40-year-old stone basin and drag it through the dye. Once the threads are completely saturated, it's time to wring them out using a spinning machine. At about 15 years old, it's the only modern piece of equipment in the workshop. After a few minutes, the yarn is hung out to dry on the roof of the workshop for about 2 hours. Then it's packaged and shipped to customers all over the world.
وبصبغ لمصلحة السجون وبصبغ للجيش ويعني وبصبغ لناس في أمريكا وبصبغ لناس في إسرائيل دلوقتي حاليا وفي فلسطين وفي سوريا وفي لبنان.
It's a family operation that often involves Salama's 12 children and many of his more than 40 grandchildren.
إحساسي بإن أنا ببقى مبسوط وفرحان بإن كلهم بيتلموا عندي وبيشتغلوا معايا وبيتعلموا. وبعدين الصنعة مش وحشة، الصنعة حلوة.
Salama has tried out a handful of professions, and he even served in the military for 9 years before settling on dyeing. Now he's been running the dye house for 45 years.
كرهت كل حاجة إلا المزبغ.
Today, business has been slower than usual since the spread of COVID-19. But it doesn't stop Salama from putting in the work.
حالة تعبانة شوي لكن ماشية. يعني أنا بقوم من النوم الساعة 4 الصبح. واخد بال حضرتك عشان أجي أشتغل وأكل عيالي.
The workshop's small-scale operation has made it hard to keep up with mass manufacturers. Most textile dyeing in Egypt and around the world today happens at larger industrial-scale factories. About 70 miles west of Salama's workshop, Chinese investors announced in 2019 the construction of what would be one of the largest textile zones in the country. The COVID-19 pandemic has slowed the project, but once in full swing, investors expected to bring in more than $8.5 billion a year. Meanwhile, Salama's sales have been dropping for more than a decade. They fell nearly 60% in 2011, after the Arab Spring protests rocked the Egyptian economy. Today, fuel prices are still too high for Salama's margins. So he cuts costs by using wood instead of gasoline to make fire and heat his dye vats. Though it might be more physically taxing, he takes pride in this traditional method.
شوف الفراعنة ماتت بقى لها كام سنة أنا بشتغل شغلتهم دلوقتي. ما بشتغلش غير شغلة الفراعنة. الفراعنة كانوا بيشتغلوا بخشب، اشتغلت بالخشب.
Salama's ancient techniques are what keep many of his customers loyal.
احنا عندنا هنا لغاية دلوقتي لغاية وقتنا هذا في ناس فلاحين وناس صعايدة وناس عرب بيلبسوا الجلابية البلدي اللي هي بإقطار وبشريط من الديل وشريط من الجنب. غير حضرتك فدلوقتي حاليا ما بيجوش غير هنا.
But his regular clients that usually put in orders every month have dropped off to every 2 or 3 months since the start of the pandemic. Still, Salama is determined to keep this business alive for as long as he possibly can.
عايز اموت وانا بشتغل وما يكونش عليا حاجة لحد. ده اللي نفسي فيه.
Indigenous people have been harvesting salt by hand in this part of Mexico for over 2,000 years. But today, half of these salt pools are abandoned. Unlike table salt, this artisanal variety is unrefined and made in small batches. But the work pays little, and many producers can't afford to carry on the tradition. Those who do remain often work alone, in a last effort to save this piece of their heritage.
O sea, el que quiere el lugar, yo creo que se podría morir, ¿no? De que le quitaran su trabajo.
We visited Zapotitlán Salinas to see how one salt producer's business is still standing. Juan Diego Hernández Cortez works on his land 7 days a week, all by himself.
No es redituable como tal, o sea, como para contratar a alguien, ¿no? Como para traer a algún ayudante.
The mountains here were once under a sea, so they're full of salt deposits. When it rains, water carries that salt down to these natural wells. Then Juan collects it.
Cada pozo tiene diferente concentración, no todos tienen la misma salinidad.
Juan carries about 40 pounds of salt water over the rocky hills, barefoot for better traction. He fills one of the man-made pools and cleans another to prepare for the filtration process. Then he pushes all the water into the cleaned pool.
Una vez que se pasó el agua para acá, aquí se queda un día o 2 días y entonces ya el lodo se queda abajo, se sedimenta.
Little by little, he transfers the water back into the empty pool through a mesh bag.
Y hacemos este filtrado para que la basura que tiene ahí es la que se va a quedar aquí. Entonces ya pasa el agua filtrada a donde ya va a empezar a cristalizar.
The liquid sits for at least 5 days, evaporating under the sun.
Empieza a formar capas de sal, un cristalizado que se forma superficial, y le echar el agua encima con una jícara del mismo cuadro y acumular capas de sal abajo.
A new layer crystallizes each day. Once there are enough, Juan shovels the crystals into a mound. He uses his feet to break down the big pieces, which aren't too sharp when they're wet. Then he piles the salt into a basket, which works like a colander, draining out all the moisture. It stays out in the sun to dry for 4 or 5 days. After it's cleaned and packaged, it sells to locals for around 10 pesos a liter, or 50 cents. He sells higher quality salt to restaurants and tourists for 30 pesos a liter, or a little more than $1. Artisanal salt like this is sought after for its unique flavor and natural properties.
No lleva ningún químico, solamente son minerales que dejó el mar hace millones de años atrapados en la tierra.
You can't find that in industrialized salt, which is often mined from underground deposits and processed to remove other minerals and add preservatives. Juan makes salt for cattle to eat too. It's drier and more bitter than human salt. It also requires extra mixing and grinding, using a stick made from an agave plant. It can take 2 months to get the cattle salt to this stage. But for all the salt Juan makes, consistent weather is crucial. That's why he only harvests during the dry season.
Si cae la lluvia y es una lluvia fuerte, esto se echa a perder. Todo lo que está ahí en sal se derrite. Hoy en día ha habido muchos cambios de clima y hoy puede llover en cualquier momento.
Between cattle salt and human salt, Juan sells about 3 tons every 6 weeks, bringing in around 2,500 pesos, or $116 per week. Juan learned the trade from his father, who learned it from his father. He's been spending long days here since he was just about 6 years old.
Incluso en algún momento, como yo era pequeño, yo le decía a mi papá, ¿ya nos vamos? Y mi papá decía, no, todavía no, hasta que cante el grillo. Si lo quiero mucho porque es herencia y porque he estado toda la vida aquí. Entonces para mí sería todo, ¿no?
Zapotitlan is located in Puebla, and it was engulfed in a sea 50 million years ago. That sea left behind salt deposits that indigenous people started harvesting at least 2,000 years ago by heating salt water in clay pots. By the 16th century, solar evaporation became the more efficient and widely used approach. Salt production boomed along with Zapotitlan's economy toward the end of the 19th century, when travelers would pass through town along part of the historic trail El Camino Real. But after the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s, the indigenous people of Zapotitlan lost half of their land. Plus, many young workers who went to fight never returned. Today, around 60 salt producers are left, and at 41 years old, Juan is one of the youngest. He says nowadays, Zapotitlan salt is underappreciated.
No la conoce y no lo valora, no lo paga, pues como debería de ser. Y para nosotros como productores, no es redituable, ¿no?
Many property owners can't afford to maintain the salt pools, and local indigenous laws prevent them from selling to anyone outside the community. So half the land sits unused.
Si se dan cuenta, igual mucho del lugar o de lo que es cada salina, se ve muchas como ruinas, no alcanza para vivir de esto y menos para reconstruir, ¿no? O reparar esta estructura, ya que todo es muy caro.
Many in the community have left to look for other work.
Pues no es tan fácil, ¿no? Trabajar aquí para en algún momento tener familia, pues no vive uno de esto, ¿no? Entonces, si hablamos de la comunidad, es pequeña, más o menos 3,000 habitantes, pero alrededor de 1,000 jóvenes están en el extranjero.
But Juan plans to stay and build towards a better future. He's banding together with 25 other producers to form a brand, which will help them sell the salt at a higher price. They've also learned how to deliver their products during the pandemic. Juan remains hopeful that the artisanal salt industry in Zapotitlan will be revived.
Yo lo veo a futuro y tiende a regresar, ¿no? Que la gente vuelva a voltear a consumir lo natural, ¿no? Lo orgánico como eso, ¿no? Lo artesanal. Y tengo esa como visión, ¿no? Que a futuro la gente va a comprarlo, va a valorarlo. E incluso también muchos jóvenes o hasta familias podrían regresar al trabajo.
Candle making has been in this family for over 300 years. Viviana Alaves is one of the last people in her Mexican village who still knows how to make these candles by hand. They were commonly used in church services and proposal ceremonies. And it was Viviana's break from tradition that saved the family business and the art form. We visited Oaxaca to see how Viviana's workshop is still standing. Making candles starts with the wax. Viviana's daughter-in-law, Guillermina, breaks it up by hand. Then, Viviana melts it over a fire, fueled by wood and corn cobs.
Yo no me usan gas. Hago de natural.
She learned the craft at around 8 years old. Her parents left her when she was a child, and her grandma couldn't afford to send her to school. She taught her to make candles instead.
Mira, dice que yo voy a dejar un trabajo para siempre.
64 years later, she runs the business with her family.
Me quedé para siempre. Me enseñaron a trabajar. Entonces yo busqué la manera cómo voy a salir adelante.
But a lot has changed. They used to get the wax from local bee farmers, but a changing climate has forced them to find another source, over 200 miles away.
Parte de Oaxaca ya son muy secados. Por eso compro de Chiapas. Y hay agua, pues. Y hay de comer las abejitas, pues.
Viviana uses a bowl as a mold and dips it first into the hot wax, then into cold water to harden it. She can make up to 40 pounds of these discs in a day. Viviana then lays them out on the roof of her house. She lives in the small village of Teotitlan de Valle. The Zapotec indigenous people have been living here since the 15th century. The discs sit for up to a month, bleaching under the sun. This purifies the wax and makes it a blank canvas, so it can be melted down again and dyed. Then it's time to make the candlesticks. These candles started out as bare wicks. One layer at a time, they pour wax over them and let them dry for 10 minutes before adding the next layer. It takes an entire month to get them to this size. The biggest candle Viviana has ever made was nearly 6 feet tall and weighed 30 pounds. Finally, they cut the bottoms to make the candlesticks even. This week, the family is filling an order of 48 candles for a proposal ceremony.
La pedida de mano, la vela es la principal.
But business wasn't always like this. Up until the 1980s, Viviana and other candle makers didn't get paid for their work. Instead, They offered the candles to the church in exchange for food.
Yo fui a dar servicio 20 años. No cobramos, pues, porque así es la costumbre de acá. Es un servicio lo que estás dando.
Eventually, most candle makers couldn't afford to keep working and moved on to other trades. But Viviana didn't give up. She came up with new designs, like flowers made out of wax instead of paper.
Regalé 2 ahí en la iglesia para que vean la gente. Poco a poco le gustaron mucho la gente.
Then she broke tradition by selling her candles in order to save the business. But her grandmother was not happy.
Sí me molestó. Lloró mucho cuando vieron mi trabajo. Pero yo le digo a mi abuela, ¿por qué lloran, abuela? ¿Para qué vamos a salir adelante? ¿Para qué le gusta a la gente?
Her creations eventually became so popular throughout town that she's now a local celebrity.
Por eso todo el pueblo tiene respeto conmigo. Porque saqué lo más bonito, pues.
Viviana and her family make hundreds of wax figurines each week. By cutting, shaping, and molding. Viviana has preserved some of the original candle elements. She still has the molds that have been passed down for 3 generations. Like this one, that she uses to make an angel figurine.
El único yo tengo ese molde. Todo lo que hacen ver. No.
And all the dyes are natural. The red color comes from an insect. She still uses paper flowers like her grandma did. But it's the flowers made from wax that she's most proud of.
Como yo saqué toda de estas modelos, botón de rosa, antes no se lleva.
Each ornament holds a certain significance.
Estas velas va a ir para pedir la mano de la novia. Este blanco es un cariño para la novia. Y el color rojo, es color cariño. Igual color rosa. Y el patito es un hombre y una mujer.
Viviana is the first candle maker to sell outside of her village. She now gets business from couples all over Oaxaca and from a jewelry store in New York City. In Mexico, each one of her candles sells for 300 pesos, or $15. And they're used for religious festivals too, like the Mayo Dormía, an annual celebration honoring the village's saint.
Es una promesa. La vela es muy sagrada para todos.
But business has been slow over the past year, as the pandemic has halted the usual gatherings.
La enfermedad que entró, ya no había nada, pues. Ni misa, ni matrimonio, ni a casar, no. Apenas ahorita que está saliendo, pero le digo, no es mucho.
Viviana is excited to get back to work.
Yo cuando voy a acabar un tanto, me alegro, voy a ganar un dinerito y va a quedar mi trabajo bien.
Viviana has taught the craft to young women in the village, so the tradition can live on after her.
Ojalá que voy a quedar este tamaño, se puede, pero año por año me siento muy cansada.
And she's counting on her daughter-in-law to pass it on to her children too.
Va a aprender, porque va a acabar mi vida, pues. Yo me siento, va a acabar mi vida. Ahorita ya me siento. Si tiene amor, lo va a hacer, porque es muy alegre. El trabajo es un alegre.
Panama hats are actually made in Ecuador. Here, people call them sombreros de paja toquilla. They're hand-woven from straw. It takes an entire day for a weaver to make one, in exchange for just $5. The tedious trade has been the main source of income in this small Ecuadorian village in the Andes for over 100 years. But now, the money isn't enough to sustain these weavers, as their cost of living has gone up. Many are losing interest in the craft and leaving the country to find more lucrative work. We visited the Weavers Association of Pujío to see how one dwindling group of artisans is fighting for their livelihoods and still standing. Angelita Espinosa learned how to weave hats at 6 years old. She starts by stripping down the straw harvested from the toquilla palm plant. Angelita keeps the straw wet so it doesn't crack, and uses her fingernails to split each piece one by one.
Tenemos que disminuir de los laterales, hablemos así, para que quede un solo grosor.
She spends anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes on this part of the process, going through 7 stalks for one hat. Then it's time to weave. Each artisan crafts a hat from start to finish to keep the stitching even.
Las mismas manos que tejen todo el sombrero. A veces duele las manos, duele la cintura, la espalda.
Weavers sell the hats unfinished to exporters. They get $5 for a thick straw hat that's made in a day. Finer straw hats sell for about 4 times more, but since those take around 5 days to make, they bring down their average income to $4 a day. To try and turn a bigger profit, other workers at the association, like Ramiro Guzman, finish some hats in-house. He tightens the stitches.
Entonces se les va cogiendo en un sentido horizontal, vertical, como se pueda manejar.
And then trims the excess straw. Spreading glue onto the hat gives it its flexibility. Panama hats are known to be malleable and durable.
Lo puedes poner de esta manera, o lo puedes poner también en esta manera.
After molding and ironing, machines take over to press the hat into its final shape. The signature black band is the finishing touch. Panama hats have been around for centuries. Indigenous people in South America were weaving hats long before the Spaniards arrived in the 1500s. They weren't popularized overseas until the 19th century, when they started getting shipped and worn across the Panama Canal. That's when the name Panama hat caught on. The hats went on to become a high-end fashion accessory throughout the US and Europe. Today, the craft is recognized by UNESCO, and the hats are worn daily by locals across Ecuador. An authentic Panama hat, sold online in the US and Europe, goes for over $50, but the Weavers Association sells a hat in Pujío for $14. Most of the profit goes to the finishing process, leaving weavers with barely enough to pay the bills.
Vamos a la tienda, compramos una libra de sal o algo así y ya se nos ha terminado los $5, $6. Nos toca el trabajo mucho más duro para nuestra sobrevivencia.
Angelita now spends more time tending to her small farm. Selling tomatoes is her main source of income. Weaving and agriculture have been the mainstays of the Pujío economy for around 150 years. But with higher costs of living today, they're no longer sustainable.
Cambio ahora, hace falta pagar del agua, de la luz. Antes de pronto, a lo mejor nuestros papás, nuestros abuelitos, sí podían sobrevivir, por decir, tejiendo en la tierra también.
And this way of life doesn't appeal to younger generations.
Los adolescentes no quieren mucho en la vida nuestra, no, porque uno pues ya de pronto una vida más austera, sencilla, y entonces por eso salen fuera.
The weavers themselves are abandoning the craft too. Many have left the country in search of a better life, and some switch to agriculture and other work. The association started out with 124 weavers back in 2005, but now just 25 remain.
A veces uno se siente impotente, el poder ayudar.
The COVID-19 pandemic has made things worse. 30 miles west of Pujío, Juan Jose Paredes has seen a significant drop in visitors at his Toquilla Hat Museum in Cuenca, a city known for its straw hats.
Nosotros el año pasado llegamos casi a las 40.000 personas en todo el año. Eso quiere decir aproximadamente 125 personas diarias. Y ahora en un buen día tenemos entre 10 y 15.
He sells a range of hats, all made by artisans in rural villages across the country. But falling demand means less work for those weavers.
Si se van los tejedores, no hay quien produzca. Entonces, si no hay quien produzca, no hay que vender. Es así de sencillo. O sea, no hay, porque si no tejes, no hay nada.
Juan believes the key to preserving the craft is getting young Ecuadorians to feel connected to it.
Y detrás de mí están un poco más de generaciones que es importantísimo que les inculquemos esto como un valor. O sea, es como cuidar tus calles, es como cuidar tu ciudad, es como cuidar cualquier cosa, porque los patrimonios son de todos.
Quisiera que nuestros jóvenes amen lo que nosotros amamos, el arte de tejer, pero por el momento sí estamos en apuros.
Angelita hopes to bring more weavers into the association in the future, and above all, share the story of the original Panama hat with people around the world.
A veces de pronto encuentran en una vitrina, pero no saben de dónde viene. A lo mejor piensan que está hecho en una máquina y no es así. Son de nuestras manos, de nuestras mujeres que tejen de aquí, de la parroquia San Martín de Puchillo.
This goatskin is about to be turned into parchment, an old kind of paper made from animal skin. It goes through a laborious process of having every last hair scraped off. The craft dates back to 2500 BC, and this is the last place in the US that still makes it. Every piece takes at least 2 weeks to make, and only a handful of people in the entire world know how.
Parchment as a product almost hasn't survived. There was almost no need for it as a material.
But it was this centuries-old work that helped Jesse Meyer save his family tannery. We visited their facility in Montgomery, New York, to see how it's still standing. Making parchment is a messy craft. It's cold and wet around the workshop, but the lingering smell is something Jesse's gotten used to. It all starts with the skin. Deer, goat, calf, and sheepskin are sent by slaughterhouses or local hunters. Jesse soaks it in a mixture of water and calcium hydroxide to break down the fibers, loosen the hair, and clean it. This is the longest part of the process, taking at least 2 weeks. Then it's time for dehairing. Jesse scrapes at the skin, pushing the hair off. He uses a makeshift tool, a 100-year-old piece of wood that has the perfect shape for the job.
Even the hand tools that we use, most people have never seen before. And in some cases they don't exist, and I've had to, recreate these tools myself.
After dehairing, he removes the extra meat layers on the other side. They've installed machines to help speed this along, but sometimes Jesse prefers the traditional way.
The more involved you can be with your own hands, the better and more control you have over the end product. But there is a point where if you're doing this on a commercial scale to try to be efficient and more economical, you don't really have the ability to handle each one by hand.
The hides then go through a thorough rinse. That adjusts the pH level after weeks of intense chemical treatment. Jesse selects some of the clean skins to be dyed in a large drum. He uses plant-based pigments and water to create a range of colors. As the skins tumble, they soak up the dye until they're saturated. He hangs the skins to dry overnight so that the color spreads evenly throughout. But most of the rinsed skins are left their natural white color and sent up to the dry room. Jesse stretches the skin to keep it flat while it dries. First, he scrapes the hide while it's wet to remove excess moisture. Then when it's dry, he shaves it to clear away tissue. He made this medieval knife with a saw blade, a threaded rod, and leather. Its proper Latin name is lunellum, for its crescent moon shape. Sanding is the very last step. Jesse refines the surface, smoothing it out until almost every blemish is undetectable. Finally, the skin is now parchment. The first record of parchment dates back to 2450 BC. Famous ancient documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Magna Carta were all written on it for its durability. The use of parchment peaked in the Middle Ages in Europe, when it was mostly used for illuminated manuscripts and book bindings. Paper made from wood pulp or plant fibers was invented in China around 105 AD. It made its way across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe through the centuries with the rise of literacy and the printed word. It was faster and cheaper to make. It quickly industrialized and rendered parchment virtually irrelevant by the 16th century. Early in the 20th century, designers incorporated parchment into high-end furniture and decor, and it is still used for that today. Preserving history is what saved parchment in this business. Conservators use the material to mend old manuscripts, make copies, and restore missing pages.
It's been a very niche product. It is something that happens alongside of leather production, and that's how I kind of rediscovered and have been trying to sort of reapply it since then.
The rare craft saved his family's centuries-old tannery business, which has been in the country since his ancestors moved here in 1820. By the time Jesse took over, demand for leather was on the decline, and by 2005, keeping the business going was getting more difficult. That's when Jesse introduced parchment making. But he struggled to find out about the process.
There are a handful of other companies around the world that do this sort of thing, and they're far, far away, and they've never told me how they do what they're doing, so I've had to try to figure this out in a vacuum, so it's me figuring it out as I go and what seems to work best for me. Because it's such an old medieval craft, anytime I would try to go look up information, a lot of times it was from medieval recipes that were written in Latin from 1400.
Eventually, parchment became such an important part of the business, Jesse changed the name from Meyer & Sons to Pergamena, which means parchment in Latin. And he found a niche of customers, conservators and designers who use the material in lampshades, upholstery, headboards, and even as wallpaper.
No two pieces of parchment look the same, so, which is a blessing and a curse. That's part of the artistry.
A single sheet starts at $100.
What started out feeling like an albatross around my neck ended up becoming a way to help revitalize the family industry. I want to be proud of this and to be able to pass it on to my family and for people to know that skilled work like this is still being done in the world. It's being made right here in the United States by a family that's been doing it for 450 years.
This is the last printing press in the US where books are handmade from start to finish. Every letter of an Ariane press book is created one by one. Together, they make up a book that can take years to produce and cost up to $10,000 to buy. That's because this San Francisco institution uses machines and techniques that date back to the 1800s. Printing presses like Ariane used to be common. But with the advent of faster and cheaper printing, this traditional method is fading away.
So now we're having to learn as much as we can before it goes away. It is a huge responsibility. I think it kind of weighs on all of us.
But at Ariane Press, the team devotes their days to preserving this historic trade, even in one of the tech capitals of the world. We visited this 101-year-old press to learn how and why it's still standing. Each book begins in the Foundry, where Brian Ferret spends his day at a monotype machine from the 1890s making individual letters.
It can be very, very difficult. There could be days where nothing goes right. There could be weeks where nothing goes right. When I have 3 casters running and nothing's going wrong, that makes me just ridiculously happy.
He lights a fire under the machine, melting the lead, tin, and antimony solution that is used to create the letters.
We have a pump here and a nozzle, and the pump draws up the lead and then we'll shoot the lead out the nozzle.
From there, the lead goes into a mold. Then, a matte case with the chosen lettering pushes down on it. He sends the finished type down the hall to the print room.
By the end of the day, particularly when we're printing, we're covered with ink, and it's just fantastic. It's kind of like a good little kid again, getting messy and getting dirty. At this stage of the process, the Foundry has sent us galleys of type. They usually come out about 2 pages per galley. When we get those galleys, we take a proof print of that.
Jeff Raymond arranges the type into a page layout, letter by letter.
So on this one, this is page 53.
To keep the page together, Jeff wraps it in string. Then he brings it to the proofing press to check for any mistakes. Once the proof looks good, it goes for the final print run on one of the larger presses. The final stage of the bookmaking process is in the bindery.
This is where everything gets made into the book from scratch.
Megan Gibbous folds, sews, and glues each piece of the book together by hand. The final product is a work of art.
I think there's nothing that can compare to physically holding a book in your hands, feeling the piece of paper, running your finger over it, and feeling how the type is impressed into the page.
However, modern technology has made this kind of letterpress printing nearly obsolete. Today, top US printers use offset printing presses that can produce 120,000 pages per hour. Before working at Ariane, Brian spent 3 years at one of these commercial factories.
I had been working, printing big runs of magazines, 24-hour-a-day type of place, 12-hour shifts. There were so many people, I couldn't even count how many people were there.
Letterpress printing just can't compete with that kind of efficiency.
I mean, there's a reason why this line of work isn't fiscally viable really anymore, because it is very time-intensive. That all adds up.
While many other traditional presses have closed, Ariane has stayed in business thanks to a group of loyal subscribers, like book collectors, institutions, and libraries. This broadside sheet of the preamble to the Constitution is one of the most recent projects to come through the print room. Making only 350 copies, this limited edition print sells for $50. Ariane also sells cases of type to order, gives public tours, and holds workshops. At 45, Brian is one of a dwindling number of people who make a living as a typecaster. And with fewer people practicing this historic craft, staff feel a personal responsibility to keep the knowledge alive.
When it comes to the casting part, there are very few people who can do it. There are so few machines around anymore. And even when you do find them, the knowledge that's out there is disappearing.
To pass on the knowledge to the next generation, Brian takes every chance he can get to share his skills. He mentors apprentices during the 4-year program at Ariane.
The first few weeks I was here, I just felt I'm surrounded by these people who are making this stuff and they knew exactly what they're doing. It's like, oh my God, you know? It's almost impossible to find a place where you can learn these skills.
Brian also shares the craft with his 6-year-old daughter in his garage at home.
Valentine's Day to you. See, Papa? Can I do that, Papa?
Sure. Okay, go. Yeah, normally you do little dots. It does feel different than newer books, you know, a mass-produced book. There's a different touch to it.
That handmade touch is striking a chord, even in the tech hub of San Francisco.
You have all these tech people, and they've been sitting at their computer all day, doing non-tactile things. And they come here and they're always crazily impressed.
This gives Ariane hope that their business and this craft will continue to live on in an increasingly digital world.
You can get a book from 500 years ago and you can still open it and you can still enjoy that book. I have files on my computer from 20 years ago that are gone because I have no idea how to open that anymore. So I think it does really last a whole lot longer than the things that we have now. The era that it was made in adds to its character and its beauty.
This is one of the oldest businesses in Japan, and aburi mochi is the only food on the menu. For over 1,000 years, the restaurant has served worshippers who visit the Shinto shrine next door to pray for good health. Many believe eating the roasted rice cakes will protect them from diseases too. The shop has survived fires, civil and world wars, and even smallpox epidemics. Through it all, 25 generations of one family kept it going, blending food and faith. But COVID-19 has threatened the business more than anything else. We visited Ichimonji Wasuke in Kyoto to see how it is still standing. It all starts with the skewers. Owner Naomi Hasegawa cuts them from a special bamboo grown for ritual purposes around the shrine. That's why they're considered sacred and treated with as much care as any ingredient. The important job of sterilizing them is only for the okami, the owner and manager.
やはり神様からいただいた櫛ですので、使えるうちは何回でも使おう、もったいないし大事に使おうという精神でやらせていただいてます。
Next, she makes the sweet miso dipping sauce. Naomi knows the recipe by heart. She measures ingredients by eye and feels the mixture for consistency. She learned it all from her aunt, the former okami.
先代はもう堅くなに一人でずっとやってらっしゃいましたけども、やはり今の世の中いつ何時何があるかわからないので、みんなができるように、家族がね、家族の女がみんなができるようには教えてあります。
She combines today's batch with yesterday's leftovers for a richer flavor. Ichiwa uses a machine to make the mochi dough instead of the traditional method of steaming and pounding with a mallet.
きっとご先祖様も私らが餅つき機を使っていることを怒ってると思いますのででも大きな大量生産をしているわけではなく、一臼一臼を必ず自分たちでするようにはしてますので、そこの機械は使いますけれども、本来の気持ちっていうのは全く変わってないと思います。こちらは黄神様、火の神様です。
Every day, she makes the first mochi as an offering for the gods and her ancestors. Then it's time to put it all together. Naomi and her employees work on a woven mat covered in roasted soybean powder. They cover the mochi in it, then measure thumb-sized pieces to stick on a skewer.
これも昔の理にかなったやり方なんですけれども、お餅ってプーッと膨れるんです。そうすると1本刺しだとポロッと落ちる。でもこう2本刺しだと落ちない。グッと締まってるっていうのが昔から確かに先人の知恵で。
To roast the mochi, she shuffles them until they reach a consistent dark color. It only takes about 1 minute, but it requires close attention since the mochi could easily overcook, or even worse, the bamboo could burn. She's even particular about the charcoal she uses. This is binchotan, a high-quality oak charcoal that's much harder than regular coals.
なぜかというと、硬いのと日持ちがいい。火が長く持つというのと、それと香りがいい。
Aburi means to roast, so this is what makes the snack aburi mochi.
このお餅を焼くという作業については、やはり10年ぐらいの修行をした人間でないとなかなかうまくは焼けないですね。
She dips the aburi mochi into the miso sauce while they're still warm. 11 skewers and a cup of green tea cost 500 yen, or just under $5. Naomi and her predecessor have kept that price steady for over 30 years, but have had to bring the number of skewers down from 15.
うちの兄は当主ですけれども、すごく儲ける必要はないと、もともとがご奉仕からできてる商売ですので、商いというのは商いようにするのが商いというふうに言われております。
The Imamiya shrine that Ichiwa serves was founded in 994, as Kyoto was suffering from epidemics like smallpox. Locals worshipped Shinto deities who were believed to cure diseases and grant long life. Naomi says Ichiwa's original founders served the chief priest, and then started the shop to serve worshippers as well. They used to give a burimochi away for free, and only sometimes received a small gratuity from pilgrims. From the beginning, it's been traditional for women in the family to run the business.
男はみんな外で自分たちの家族の生活費を働いてくれてます、稼いでくれてますので、ですから女がここで働くのは家を守るという、ここの炙り餅一文字屋を守るというので、私は娘ですけれども、兄嫁も弟嫁もここを守る。
Naomi is the 25th Okami to run Ichiwa, taking over for her aunt 13 years ago. And she has made a few improvements to bring the business into the modern age, like providing insurance to its employees and installing a time card system. But she draws the line at using delivery apps.
うちは丁寧にお断りしました。そうして持っていくようなお餅ではないです。ここにお参りに来ていただいて、炙り餅があるので、お参りもせずに、神様に予定も合わせずに、ウーバーイーツで持っていくというような、そんな商品はっていうか炙り餅は作ってないです。
Although Ichiwa was born from a time of plague, nothing could have prepared the staff for the coronavirus pandemic. The shop was forced to close for nearly 2 months in 2020, and it took on debt to ensure employees were still getting paid even while it was shut. Even the government's National Tourism Incentive Program wasn't enough to bring many customers back.
お正月とか三が日っていうのは私どもにとってはものすごく大切な、神社に参拝する日ですので、ものすごく大切な三が日なんですけれども、このコロナで半分以下の人手になってました。
Naomi's hopes for the future lie in the next generation of her family. She believes her children, or nieces and nephews, will take over for her, but there's no set succession plan. And that's intentional.
誰か一人って決めたらものすごくプレッシャーで、私がプレッシャーで嫌なようにプレッシャーになります。その時、神様が、ご先祖様が決めてくれると思います。
She says she'd enjoy retirement, but until that day, there are faithful visitors to feed.
だから今宮神社さんがあるうちは私どもは辞めないつもりです。今宮神社さんが潰れたとともに私どもは引こうと思ってます。そこまでは辞めない。多分ご先祖様もみんなそうだと思います。
This is how olive oil soap is made in the West Bank. It's being poured on the floor to cool and solidify. The Palestinian tradition goes back over 1,000 years. But while the West Bank once had nearly 40 soap factories, Nablus Soap Company is just one of 2 still operating. And today, a once thriving industry is struggling to stay afloat. Nablus soap is made from just 3 ingredients: olive oil, baking soda, and water.
حول لصابونة ريحة طيبة ومن دون أي مواد كيماوية. بس مواد طبيعية موجودة هي زيت.
The first step is to cook all 3 ingredients together in a huge stainless steel pot.
حوالي بتاخذ 5 طن زيت. طبخة الصابون بدك أول يوم بتدير الزيت والصودا بتتركهم منقوعين وثاني يوم بتكملهم طبيخ.
When it's ready, workers carry out the boiling hot liquid 1 bucket at a time. They pour the liquid soap onto the floor where it cools. Next, they measure out and mark the soap with an outline of the distinctive Nablus bar shape.
وكيف بدك تعرفه بشكله هذا وهو حافظ على شكله وعلى سوقه بشكله المربع.
Workers use hammers to stamp the soap with the Nablus Soap Company seal, and it takes 1 or 2 days just to cut the soap and pile it up. Then it's left for 40 days to dry before it's packaged and sold. While the Nablus Soap Company carries on this tradition, the soap-making industry in the West Bank has dwindled from nearly 40 factories at its height in the 19th century to just 2 working factories in Nablus. Israeli restrictions in the West Bank have made exporting soap difficult. Plus, demand for the soap among Palestinians has dropped off.
30 سنة يطلع في كل يوم مثلا 3 طن صابونة، اليوم بيطلعش 500 كيلو صابونة بتبيع أو 200 كيلو صابونة.
That's because many customers are choosing their soap based on price rather than quality.
وهي الصابونة النابلسية غالية بالسوق، يعني زيت الزيتون مرتفع والسودا مرتفعة، يعني ما بيجي الواحد يشتري فرقة صابونة ب3 شيكل للبقال وبلاقي موجود 5 فلق ب3 شيكل عند البقال تركي أو صيني موجود في البلد وبكل الروائح، فهو بفضل ياخذ ال5 قطع ب3 شيكل.
Despite the downturn, the Nablus Soap Company still employs 10 permanent workers and hires up to 10 more temporary employees as needed.
يعني إنها الصابونة هاي إنه إنها كانت إنها طعميك خبز، إنها حاليا أنا بقى يعني الحمد لله اشتغلت منها وتجوزت منها ويحد اليوم شغال في المصنع والحمد لله رب العالمين.
And for Ahmad, producing Nablus soap is essential to keeping a 1,000-year-old tradition alive.
وهي كمان إرث الأجداد زي ما بقول لك يحافظ عليه الأجيال القادمة، تحافظ على الصناعة القديمة وعلى التراث تبعك فيها. إذا غيرتها بتبطل يصير عندك تراث.
Red wooden horses run through the blood of the people in Nusnäs, Sweden. Dolahästar, or Dala Horses, are traditional handicrafts that have been around for centuries. They are commonly known as children's toys or sometimes religious items. They've also been used as a form of currency. Today, they are a national symbol. But only 2 main factories still make them by hand, with local wood and the traditional Phyllo red paint. In early 2020, we visited one of the oldest Dala horse factories in Sweden to see how it's kept this tradition still standing. Artisans here at Nils Olsen Dolahästar start with locally sourced pine or alder wood. They stamp the outline of the horse onto the planks. Carpenters roughly shape the figurine with a bandsaw. This is the only part of the process that uses a machine, and they want to keep it this way.
Vi som alla andra påverkas väl också av det här att mer och mer blir ju ska ju utföras med maskiner mer och mer. Så, och det är väl lite så att
Mattias Olsen is the grandson of one of the factory's founding brothers who started it in 1928. Today, he does everything he can to stick to the century-old way of making Dala horses.
Det här är ju ett hantverk. Blir det för mycket maskiner i det här så då kanske meningen med hantverket.
The finer details of each figure are done by hand. Roland Prestans takes about 15 minutes to carve a horse, depending on its size. He's worked at Nils Olsen for about 40 years and is technically retired, but he keeps working in his spare time because even at 75 years old, he loves the craft.
Ja, jag är självlärd. Jag har fått lära mig själv. Man har sett hur andra gör. Sen får man börja själv. Jag kommer härifrån byn. Jag är född här i byn.
Then it goes for its first dip to get a solid base coat. Smaller horses are plunged into a bucket of paint to cover the whole figurine. Then they're set on a tray to drip off, and any excess paint dribbles back down into the bucket to be reused. And it's not just any old red used to paint them. It's Sweden's famous Phyllo red, a classic rusty red-orange color that comes from the mines in the region of Dalarna. After drying, the pieces go through a series of quality checks with Mattias.
Så det är inte bara att sätta som målaren och läst på en träbit så att säga. Du lär ha lite konstnärskunnande.
Then they're dipped again to get 1 or 2 more coats to ensure an even color. Painters like Kerstin Reuterberg have it down to a science. She lines up her brushes by color so she can work quickly.
Jag målar ungefär 80 hästar om dag. Att måla en häst tar ungefär 4-5 minuter.
And while all the horses are decorated in the traditional folk art style called krupits, painting by hand means each one is unique. And just like her colleagues, Kirsten is proud of the place Dala Horses have in her heritage.
Jag har målat i 40 år. Min mamma lärde mig när jag var 13 år ungefär. Jag är född här i Nusnäs och så har jag en dotter som har börjat lite grann. Jag tröttnar inte på att måla. Det är det bästa jobb som finns.
The artisans churn out about 500 horses a day of all shapes, sizes, and colors, although red is the traditional and most popular choice. Americans, and the world at large, were first introduced to Dala horses at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, where a giant wooden Dolahost greeted visitors to the Swedish pavilion. But today, anyone looking for a classic Dala horse can buy one from Niels Olsen, online or at the workshop. The smallest horses sell for about $20, and the larger ones can cost about $1,500.
Det är ju Sveriges nationalsymbol. Det är ju snart det enda svenska hantverket som finns kvar, som görs för hand här.
But Matthias is optimistic about the future for both the business and the art form.
Vi ser ju det att det finns ett enormt intresse för hantverket där ute. Det är många som mejlar till oss och ringer till oss och vill lära sig tälja och måla. Så det ligger viss stolthet i det och det vill man ju gärna vara med och föra vidare såklart.
The last step of creating the perfect piano sounds like total chaos. The basher machine breaks in every key thousands of times to ensure it all works perfectly.
It's the worst noise in the world.
Adam Cox runs the last piano factory in Britain. Here, artisans take months to thread steel strings and install felt hammers, tuning and testing for quality at each step of the lengthy process. A century ago, the UK had hundreds of factories producing some of the best pianos in the world. But a flood of cheaper, foreign-built instruments forced all of them to close down. That's why Adam opened Cavendish Pianos in 2012 in an attempt to save the craft.
It is the sort of thing that if it gets lost for one generation, that's it really, it's the end of it.
We visited his shop in Northern England to meet the last British piano makers still standing. A Cavendish piano build starts with a soundboard, a flexible sheet of wood that amplifies the sound of the strings.
It's a very thin, very light piece of wood, and it needs to be, because it needs to vibrate lots.
It's the most expensive component. The wood only comes from spruce trees that grow at just the right altitude to produce a rich tone. Adam uses wooden sticks called go bars as temporary supports to set the glued wooden ribs on the soundboard's gentle curve.
The soundboard is not a flat assembly, but it's actually got a crown, and that is the all-important thing for producing the tone of the piano. It's like the cone of a loudspeaker, really. And so that will go down onto these back posts now.
Factories in Asia can quickly machine press the soundboard. But Adam says his customers prefer the methods piano makers have used for over 100 years.
A piano that's made slowly will be a better piano than a piano that's made fast.
Adam and his team align the soundboard to the back post and then attach it to the heavy cast iron frame.
Even Adam's helping, look.
And so I get the wet.
The important thing is not to get your finger trapped.
The frame is cast as a single piece. It has to be strong enough to withstand about 20 tons of pressure from all the strings. About 230 strings are used to create the 88 tones on an average piano. Each one is painstakingly threaded through a tuning pin, and then hammered into place. It's the sort of work that makes your fingers sore. The strings vary in length and thickness to create different tones. Longer, thicker strings produce lower notes, while shorter and thinner ones reach the higher end of the scale. A technician tunes the newly strung piano and lets it rest several times so that the instrument can adjust to the new tension and hold a consistent sound. Then it's time to enclose it in the wooden case and give the piano its classic look.
If you can imagine that this was put upright like that, this would be where the keys are to be played. This is the leg of the piano, and the caster would be on the bottom here.
Adam works with a cabinet maker down the road to create both standard finishes and custom designs.
If someone comes along and says, I want a blue piano, which is what has just happened, of course. Yeah, it's really nice to be able to produce a one-off thing for people that they can't get anywhere else in the world.
It puts more pressure on the Cavendish team, though. A scratched piece can't be easily replaced.
I don't like damaging them anyway, but I will take a little extra care with this one in particular.
The final components are the keyboard and what's called the action. This is the intricate wooden mechanism that pushes the hammers onto the strings when a key is pressed. Each of the 88 keys is placed in order, and a technician must wait, measure, and adjust every single one several times.
The margins are so fine with everything, it's fractions of a millimeter.
Hammerheads are tightly wrapped felt layers that can withstand hitting the steel strings for years without wearing down. The heads are glued to a shank, a wooden rod that allows the hammer to move. But they're not one size fits all. Heavier shanks are paired with lower notes, and the Cavendish team tests this by ear. A proper hand-built action is individualized to each piano frame. And once all the parts are in place, the piano is thoroughly tested with the basher. It takes about 3 months to finish a piano. That's why Cavendish only makes about 50 every year. Pianos were invented by Bartolomeo Cristofori in Italy in the early 1700s. Called forte pianos, they were improvement on the harpsichord because the hammers responded to a hard or soft touch to create dynamic tones. Classical-era composers like Mozart and Beethoven popularized piano music. And during the Industrial Revolution, piano making spread across Europe. Britain touted its burgeoning piano industry at the Great Exhibition in 1851. By then, London alone boasted around 200 manufacturers producing 23,000 pianos a year. Pianos became a must-have item in the country's households, from working-class families to the upper crust, for both decoration and entertainment. But the 20th century brought new diversions into British homes. Radio in the 1920s.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news.
And then television in the 1950s.
The Queen is now able to receive the emblems of majesty.
And in the past 40-some years, consumers have preferred electronic keyboards, which can synthesize a variety of sounds and take up less space. The killer blow for Britain's piano industry came from cheaper foreign imports. Mass-produced instruments made in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost. Today, China, Japan, and Indonesia hold over 60% of the global piano market. A Cavendish piano starts at $7,500, and a full-size grand piano costs $30,000. That's double the price of Adam's competitors. And in the beginning, that price point kept customers away.
Our first year, we made 2 pianos. Then our second year, we made around about 6 pianos, and it's taken us a long time to get to the stage we are at now.
But the still fairly small scale of the business isn't the only hurdle Adams had to overcome. There are also scores of older, used pianos that many people give away for free just to be rid of them, or because they would be even costlier to restore to their former glory than buying new.
Put it this way, the first half of a piano's life is a lot more valuable than the last half of the piano's life. I know it's all a bit sad, isn't it? And I'm getting old, but you know, I can always look back fondly to when I was younger. But they're not like violins, you see. Violins improve with age. So we have the best violins in the world were made hundreds of years ago. That's not true with pianos.
So while the market may be smaller in the future, Adam wants Cavendish to keep making high-quality instruments.
Well, it'd be nice if it carries on going after me. That would be the main thing, really.
He offers apprenticeships to a new generation of British artisans and partners with the only school in the country that offers technical piano-making courses. All to stay focused on what led him to start Cavendish in the first place, not letting the craft disappear.